It says preparing on mine. There we go.
Says we're now streaming live. Let me check. Yes, we are.
Excellent. Well, hi, everybody that's just tuning in on Facebook for our Mystical Mondays. We are Seaside Shadows Haunted History Tours. I'm Courtney, and we have Laura and Andrew here as well. This is our weekly Q&A for you to ask us questions about ghosts, about ghost tours, about ghost hunting, and about our weekly segments that we do throughout the rest of the week on Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays. So be sure to send us some questions during this session so that we can answer them. To start, I just wanted to go over what we talked about in our sessions this week, kind of get the ball rolling so that you guys have some things to ask about. So on Witchy Wednesday, we did some full moon celebrating and some scrying. Scrying being using any vessel, be it a cauldron with water or smoke or a mirror, to get images of the future and typing into your psychic intuition. And then we also had Cemetery Saturday, which was overwhelmingly popular with a lot of people who are into their personal genealogy and who are interested in the Salem witch trials, and a very tall legend about a man named Thomas Carrier who
I like what you did there.
Yes, it sounds like a tall tale, but he was very, very real. Husband of Martha Carrier, who was executed in the Salem witch trials, who has her own amazing story, but his goes all the way back to being a king executioner, standing trial in Salem, and then moving to Connecticut. So fascinating life once he moved to Connecticut as well. Lived to 109 reportedly. And then we had Spooky Story Sunday with one of my favorite spooky stories, the Headless Horseman, with the little known fact that there's not just the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow, which has become so popular, but the Headless Horseman of Canton, which came about during the same year as the legend of Sleepy Hollow, and is reported to be the victim of a murder. And there's actually archaeological proof of the skeleton of this Headless Horseman, who has been seen galloping up and down the streets of Connecticut. So there's been a lot of really, really cool content this week, from tales, like Headless Horseman, to Salem witch trials history, and of course the full moon on top of that. So we've had a really active week. And I would like to open up now while you guys have a chance to send questions. I know the team and I here, we're talking about stuff we forgot to say during our sessions. I was the first on Witchy Wednesday. I had this entire thing planned about Nostradamus and his history of scrying, and how that's actually how Nostradamus made all these predictions for hundreds of years past his life and for the royalty that he worked for. And so for those of you who are questioning if scrying has been used by cultures other than the Celts and the Norse, the answer is absolutely yes. It's been used by a variety of cultures, and he is probably the most famous of scryers. But I also know, Andrew, you mentioned there were a few things about Thomas that you wanted to add in. And Laura, you mentioned that there were some things related to the Headless Horseman that you wanted to add in. So I'll let you guys go. If we go chronologically, Andrew, I'll let you go first with whatever you felt like you wanted to say about Thomas that you didn't get to say.
There wasn't actually anything super specific. I just left out a couple of dates because there are so many dates attributed to Thomas Carrier, and at this point it's kind of a grab bag of which of these dates is actually the truth. But there wasn't a whole lot of specific information. I definitely could have gone very heavy into the factual or believed factual about him.
Yeah. I felt like you did a good job considering it was a May snowstorm during your session outside, and there were snow flurries coming down in front of your face. And
And it
landing on you, I was like, there it is. He's in the snow squall.
was so windy. It was like my hat was strapped onto my head tighter than it's ever been, I want to say.
I guess it added to the spookiness. I mean, I found it really compelling that the stone was left in marble, but he may not be there. I thought that that was really interesting. And one of the things that I thought was of relevance with Thomas that I kept thinking of is right before the witch trials and right before all this craziness in his life, his wife was treating her family and caretaking for their smallpox in the smallpox outbreak up in Massachusetts. And then as soon as they come back from treating their family and possibly symptomatic themselves, they start getting accusations of witchcraft. And part of me wonders if that those accusations came upon them because people were scared that they were sick, and how reflective that is of today. So I don't know if you felt similarly at all.
Oh, definitely. The smallpox definitely played into the fact that they thought that they were witches, and then the fact that the immediate family seemed, though they got the disease, they seemed somewhat protected from it because none of them got seriously ill, other than unfortunately two very young children for the carriers. But all of the townsfolk started getting sick, and sick to a level that the carriers weren't. And then 13 souls did end up dying. And when Martha was on trial in Salem, one of the things that the young girls of Salem referenced was the 13 souls of Andover, who they claimed they could see around the woman.
Oh, that's so interesting that, their sickness also contributed to the accusations and was blamed on the supernatural as well. I'd like to say we've come a long way, but that's not entirely true. And there is a lot of, I think, as we go through a pandemic, a lot of pointing fingers and where have you been and who have you talked to, and it's definitely interesting to see how other generations handled it centuries before and all the similarities. But I think that probably changed Thomas as a person. I'm sure being an executioner, he had a pretty interesting personality to begin with. We'll put it that way. To execute royalty and then just casually come on over to the US was a choice. Before it was the US, just come over to the colonies like, oh, did that, done here, bye now. And then wrapped up in the witch trials was a life.
He touched so many facets of history at that point. It's really incredible. And then the fact that he's 10 minutes down the road from me was just, it's mind-boggling how much history is all around us, and it's one of the reasons I love what we do.
Yeah, and for anyone who's watching, the Carrier family has burials primarily in Colchester, and they were temporarily moved to Marlborough, and some of them may still be there. A lot of them are in the Colchester burying ground, but there's also, once we get into the mid 1800s, we see the Carriers expand a bit, and there's a lot going into the 1800s that are buried in Lakeview Cemetery in East Hampton. So there's a lot of people in central Connecticut who go up to Salem as a pilgrimage because they know the Carriers moved to the area, and they are descended from them. And it was exciting to see in the comments and in the response, a lot of descendants of Martha and Thomas Carrier were really excited to see this burial stone and hear the story of their ancestor, who was legendary in the story that not all of them knew. So that's one of the really things I love about these cemetery segments, is that people are starting to get to meet people they're related to in these bits of history they didn't know were close. And Laura, I, was really pumped that the Headless Horseman is our Revolutionary era, our favorite thing, and that it also had ties to the French soldiers. And one of my favorite guys, Marquis de Lafayette, is of course a representative of that, one of your favorites too. And then I know you wanted to talk a little bit about how the French soldiers and how that played into the Headless Horseman romping through the streets.
Well, first I have a comment that was just made by Stacy. Hi, Stacy. Stacy said, if schools made history as fun as you do, I would have had better grades, LOL.
Thanks. I think the ghosts help us out a lot with that, but thank you.
That is true, though. I mean, everyone's like, oh, you must have loved history in school. I'm like, no.
Yeah, a lot of it's that, what motivates me is I want you to be able to envision them and for a moment feel as if you know them. And then that really helps kind of immerse you into it, and you can't help but be invested in their life at that point.
Yeah. I'm invested in Marquita Lafayette. So
yes, the best.
So what I was going to talk about a bit more about the Headless Horseman is he was French, and he was murdered on his way to the Saratoga campaign. A lot of people talk about, the Battle of Saratoga. It was a whole campaign from June to October of 1777. And it was led by Benedict Arnold, who's from Norwich, Connecticut, so a local traitor. But he got
first.
Hero first, then traitor. He got what he deserved. We were just talking last week about where he's buried in London, and he's buried in the basement of a church in the nursery schoolroom behind an aquarium. So
cursed to watch little children all day. I don't.
Children screaming and just fish in the background. So yeah, nobody's terribly interested in him anymore. So just as well. But he was the one leading it before he was a traitor, and this Frenchman was on his way to pay the salary of those French soldiers. And the French were notorious for being very strict about how they would pay their officers. So in the Continental Army, they really were not good about pay. They were so many delays in paying officers and soldiers, but the French were like, nope, you're going to get paid every single month. So that's why it was so strange that this man had disappeared, is because there was never any problems with it being on time. But a lot of people are kind of surprised when we talk about the French and the importance in the American Revolution. I mean, Courtney and I love the Revolution and we love talking about it. Marquita Lafayette is one of our boys. We love him so much. So what's interesting is he actually arrived in America the day before the Saratoga campaign began, which I found very interesting. But he came to the South first. He made his way up the East Coast from South Carolina. But he was made a major general in July of 1777. So he did have some part of the revolution during the campaign of Saratoga. But for him, it wasn't so much he was sent there as much as he just felt like it was the right thing to do. He was very young. He was 19 and he heard about the revolution. He's like, I'm going over there. And the king didn't want him to go over. His family didn't want him to go over. Nobody in America wanted him to come over. And he said, fine, I'll buy my own ship, sail my way over there, and demand that Washington let me be a part of this.
And it worked.
And it worked. Washington loved him so much that he started referring to him as his son, and he ended up being his adopted child because Washington had no biological children of his own. And so it was a very touching relationship, but he was so important in the revolution. He was in Hamilton, like, he's very important. They mentioned Rochambeau in Hamilton as well, another very famous Frenchman. They had a huge part in the revolution. We would not have won without them. So that's why it's so interesting that it was this Frenchman. And I feel like we should care more about the fact that this man was just doing it because he truly believed in the cause, even if it wasn't his own country.
Absolutely. And I think it can't go overstated how young Marquita Lafayette was when he came here and was in the war. Like, he was, what many of us would consider a kid, in his early 20s, and very, very young to be that motivated and wanting to help and to get involved in creating what we know today and creating a country. So I think it's really cool that, the whole story of him and his troops became involved in a local legend like the Headless Horseman. And I think what's interesting is that the way I interpret the legend is that they're still trying to, the Headless Horseman's still trying to keep his mission going.
Yeah.
He's still trying to get there, which goes back to how seriously they took it. And, why else would he be roaming, trying to sort things out if he wasn't trying to complete what he set out to do and take care of his people? That darn innkeeper was, yeah. He obviously got the money, but yeah, I think he changed that. And I also find it interesting, and we'll do a full compare with Sleepy Hollow one week. I think that would be really cool if we compare the Headless Horseman legends. But I think what's really cool about Canton is there's this documented event that we know happened, and there's documentation from, going into the 19th century and beyond of the sightings of this, and it's always been attributed to the same person, whereas in Sleepy Hollow there's a variety of starts to the legend. I don't know that they have the archaeological proof either, so I think having a skeleton without a skull is a really good start at proving our Headless Horseman to exist. And it also, to me, ties in with a lot of legends that came later, which we'll be doing a lot of talking about at Seaside Shadows, of the vanishing hitchhiker, the person on the side of the road that you give a ride to, and you find out later that there's somebody who died, or they were some sort of deity or whatever they may be. So I think that there's something to be said too about this phantom on the roadside. People say they see him going to shops, driving down the road. So
when you mentioned the person who you didn't know that they were dead, all I thought of was Pee Wee Herman, and I thought of Large Marge. That was like the first thing I thought of.
Yeah. I always think of, and I'll probably talk about this when I do more Vanishing Hitchhiker, and I've never found out the name of this movie. How Disney made their own movies back in the day? Like, I don't know. They were pretty good, I thought, as a kid. But one of them was like about this girl in the 50s who, like, she's probably going to prom. I don't really know. I was a kid. I wasn't focused on her end destination. But she goes off like a bridge, and she's always like coming back on the bridge in this 50s gown, getting rides in the car. So whenever I think of like trying to get to her dance, and so whenever I think of like the Vanishing Hitchhiker, I'm like, Disney made a movie about her. Like, I swear to God. Say like her name is like Susie Q, which is now like I know a CCR song, but I'm gonna find it. I'm gonna say like Disney maybe took it down because they were like, this is
dark for Disney.
Dark. But it was real. I remember as a kid being like, wow, like she's still there. That's why I do ghost tours now.
Correlation.
So Stacy commented, she said, you definitely succeed with that. You always leave me wanting to know more.
Oh, good. We always want to know more too. I can definitely vouch for us at Seaside Shadows that once we start finding a story, we can't help but find more information and try to find ways to get all of it out there without having you have to sit there for like 8 hours a day listening to us talk about everything we found. But there's a lot of fascinating information out there. It really is.
But it's like what you said. A lot of these times we don't find the story finds us.
Yeah. It's crazy. I, have a list, an ongoing list, especially now that we're going to be virtual for a while, or what we foresee to be a while. It's, here in Connecticut, we don't really have a lot of information, but we think probably for a while. I have a list of graves and legends that we're going to be going over and places to investigate safely when we can. And I have the list going, but every week I don't pick something from the list. Something else comes into being. There's like this, someone needs to talk that week, and it usually ends up being this really like not coincidental anniversary of something pivotal in their life or their death. And Thomas was actually supposed to be not this week, but last week. And then when you went to the cemetery and I saw on his stone that he died this week, I was like, that's why. Yeah. So it's weird how like circumstances happen and they make it happen on their time frame, which I actually, I think spirits probably help us make it interesting. I always credit them. Like we wouldn't have good stories if they didn't have interesting lives. So it's really them that do all the work. We just get to be kind of ambassadors of it, which is really, really fun. But we definitely have a lot more exciting stories, and I think that this is the perfect time, and you guys probably feel the same, to be sharing stories from the past that haven't been, talked about for a while. We all need something to like give us these insights and an older sense of entertainment as well, which their legends were. So it's been pretty interesting. And I will say, one of the reasons I'm really glad we got to do Thomas Carrier, and I'll let you talk about how it almost wasn't Thomas Carrier for this session in a minute, how it was almost someone else in the family. But I'm really glad that we touched on that. We will be talking about Salem witch trials in the future, and potentially doing a virtual Salem tour for you guys in the next month or two, so that you can meet some of the places up in Salem that are associated with the accused and executed. I don't call them all witches because a lot of them weren't, but they were accused and executed people, and their story is important. But there's also a lot of ghosts in Salem from their merchant business over the years. And we'll be doing a virtual tour up there soon, so that if you didn't get to make it up there on one of our tours, or you're stuck at home and you're missing some Salem, that will be an option. But I will talk a bit about one of my favorite Salem people. But Andrew, I'm going to have you talk first about how it almost wasn't Thomas, to show how spirit kind of works in mysterious ways.
So Courtney and I were discussing before last Saturday which of the graves that I could go and visit. And we actually had first landed upon Richard Carrier, who is Thomas Carrier's son. And then we started digging more and more. And then the facts started coming out about Thomas and how he was a giant, how he was long lived by just wild imaginations, how he might have been a kingslayer. And then I felt, and you felt as well, that we immediately had to pivot into Thomas over Richard. Not that I don't, like I said in the video, I want to go and see Richard's resting place as well. But Thomas just right away captured my imagination and my fascination.
And one of the things I think that first drew us to Richard, and not to diminish it, was how Richard was forced to confess during the witch trials. And I'll let you kind of recap how he was forced to confess to being a witch, what they did to him.
So 4 out of the 5 of the children were imprisoned. And by all accounts, Richard and Andrew got tortured the worst of it. And the torture was really just to try and get the confession that they were witches and that their mom was a witch, and that she had made them into witches. And one quote, I believe it's by John Abbott, was that he witnessed the boys in prison being hung by their heels until blood came out their nose and threatened to come out their eyes. So just unspeakable torture on the account of, hey, we think these guys might be witches. And that sort of torture, I mean, they obviously couldn't think straight, that much blood in their heads. So I don't honestly blame them for eventually confessing to witchcraft and confessing that their mother had coerced them into witchcraft. But it is said that the jury did not take into account their testimony because it had gotten out that it had only been made because they were tortured.
Yeah. And I think it's important that when we talk about the trials, we talk about the fact that a lot of the accusations do come from people in the family and friends and very close neighbors. But when we look at the hysteria that's surrounding Salem and the pressure that's physically being put upon these people that are close by and being tortured to confess against their loved ones, it's very clear that their loved ones didn't believe that the people they knew were witches, but they were forced into saying so to feed the hysteria that was ongoing. And another thing that a lot of people don't realize about Salem, and I'm glad we mentioned Thomas and his sons, even though Martha, the poor woman, was executed at such a young age, is that men were equally accused in Salem and men were executed as well. And I think a lot of people are surprised because they associate witches with being a woman, and that the Salem witch trials was an attack on women, but it was an attack on people that were perceived in the community to be different or not following the grain of what others believed they should be doing. And I think that the Carrier story really displays that, how that runs through a family, forces them into that position, and shows that the community clearly had something against them, like we mentioned for the smallpox. And one of my favorite people to talk about in the Salem witch trials, other than Giles Corey, who was the man who was pressed to death, and when you take the virtual tour, we'll talk to you about him. But there's Bridget Bishop, who was the first woman who was executed in Salem in the trials, and my husband is actually a descendant of hers. And so I really wanted to find out more about Bridget Bishop, and I did, and I will tell you that not coincidentally, we were up in Salem doing some research when we went by the area where they were all supposedly hanged to death. And there was a tent being set up, and it was actually the official commemoration of Proctor's Ledge being the spot, and the archaeologists and authors who confirmed it were there, and let Marty kind of sit in one of the front rows and me with him because he was a descendant of Bridget. And I think that that was not a coincidence that we happened to be visiting on that day, you know, near the anniversary. But she was a woman who was essentially accused because she fought with her husband in public when he was really mean to her. And he died, and they blamed her, but she was tortured throughout her life for being a woman who stood up for herself and who wore colors like red in public. And so she was one of the first to be picked to be accused of witchcraft. And one of the things she said is, "I know not what a witch is, so I cannot be one." And they said, "How do you know you are not one if you know not what a witch is?" So when we think about that, they were finding any way possible to accuse these people. And that in and of itself is haunting, and it carries on through their descendants. And that's right here in Connecticut. But there's definitely a lot more to it. But hopefully we'll get to see you guys in Salem, and you'll get to meet some of those interesting people. But if you're in Connecticut, definitely visit the cemeteries, because some of their folks came here, and you know, their stories are still told, and their descendants are still around, and their names have been cleared up in Salem, but it took a couple hundred years. So bear in mind that. And they did finally get a prayer. They were practicing Christians, most of these people, and they did get kind of a prayer to release their souls for the first time at Proctor's Ledge. So I think that that helped the haunting there, even though it didn't fully rid of it, but something to keep in mind. So we'll definitely get more involved with New England ties as they relate to modern history as well. Now, did you guys have any questions or thoughts about the segments this week?
I really enjoyed mine, and I'm very much looking forward to doing more research into Thomas and Martha and the whole family. I want to go to each of the plots. I'm not sure if we will be allowed in the, like, where the family plot was, but I definitely want to do some investigating, especially because record has that 2 bodies that were buried on the family plot were never moved. And there's no record of who was actually moved. So two of these people could still be on the family plot, and their remains could be there.
Is Martha recorded in anything you read? Her
Um,
burial?
no, unfortunately, everything I read about Martha was that she was buried in unmarked graves in Salem.
Yeah. So traditionally what they stated is that they were buried in a shallow grave underneath the tree where they were hanged at Proctor's Ledge, which I just mentioned. And that's named after John Proctor, who was accused and executed. But a lot of family accounts state that in the night, some of the family members would go and get the body of their loved one and bring them home and bury them on the family property. I think most famously, Rebecca Nurse was documented to have been carried back by her family and buried on the property, but they would have had to keep it a secret, which makes total sense. But they never found any bodies or evidence of bodies left on the ledge. So they assumed everybody was taken home. So was Martha eventually brought to Connecticut? Were they moved pretty immediately? Is she one of the unnamed that was left? There's like so many questions on where they are. Yeah. But the fact that, officially it's documented they were on the ledge, but no one was ever found on the ledge, and that family records state that people were getting them, makes me think that she could very well be in Colchester, Connecticut as well.
She could. Or she could also be in Marlborough with whichever of the family members they ended up moving over there.
Yeah, depending on how they marked or recorded things back in the day. I do think it's really cool. I loved the fact that we're kind of based, we're all based in central Connecticut right now, but that Thomas's walk was from the area close to where Andrew and I live, and then walks to where Laura lived on a daily basis. And honestly, like, I would not be walking to Glastonbury at 100 years old or even 33 years old on a daily basis. Thank you. So that was mighty impressive, but also an interesting tie. And I'm really looking forward to when social distancing is over and I can go investigate the Salem trials more, but also I really want to see the Headless Horseman.
What I think is so cool as well about the sighting, that living in New England, a lot of our roads follow all the old roads. So I love the fact that, you think it's odd that some 18th century ghost is riding down the road, and it's like, no, because that was the road. That's why you always see all of our stone walls, is because, that's where the property ended. That's where the road was.
Yeah. And I mean, it's pretty clear, Route 44 in Canton, like, that's where you go, and that's where people drive, and people have been seeing him like going by their cars or as their cars go by, which is pretty wild. And another thing that I thought was wild this week is on Witchy Wednesdays, I usually do like a tutorial. And if you guys have watched, you see it's like I do the spell creation or the psychic prediction, but it's more of like how you can do it at home, because I want people to know that they can have magic in their own lives. Like, herbal medicine works at home. You can use predictive tools at home. You can make full moon water at home. That's just supposed to be very pure and energized. But when I was doing the scrying this week over the water, and I really tried to set it as a broad intent so that I wouldn't get anything too specific or too, wild. But all of the images that I got were really on point for, what's going on with the symbol of an arrow and the symbol of a black bird. And kind of like the arrow, like saying that we're being propelled forward too quickly, and the blackbird signaling danger. And I thought that was really, really interesting that would come in just a tutorial session this week. So I think for anyone watching, that's something I definitely took to note. And I'm interested to see what your intuitive feelings are. And if you scry at home, if you get similar energy. I was actually just talking with someone today about how the energy is a little bizarre today. I don't know how you guys are feeling psychically, spiritually, but I thought that it was a little bit of an anxious energy.
I think it has been for the past week because, you mentioned you're kind of feeling off on the Witchy Wednesday, and then I was feeling really off with my Spooky Sunday. I think in the past week, I've been feeling like off energy.
Yeah. Yeah. And it has been bizarre. For those of you waiting to come take tours, even though Connecticut is opening up, and I say that loosely, like they're not really doing much, but on May 20th, you're allowed to do a few more things than you're allowed to do now. Guided tours are not one of them, but when they announced that things are going to start opening up, I thought something's not right. I want to go back out there and do tours, but something's not right. And I think there's been an anxious energy building up. That was kind of a first sign, but something is off this week. I thought it was just me during the Witchy Wednesday, and then I thought, we had some stuff going on in my family, and I thought maybe it was just that manifesting, and I was reading into it. But I do think that we've discussed enough that those things aren't coincidences, and that something is going on, that's influencing the spirit world a bit. And one of the things I've noticed too is that while I have felt the human spirits that we've talked about, I've felt a lot more like what I can only describe as higher beings, like people that are coming in to try and help us. So I'm really interested to see where they bring us in the next few weeks. But I feel really encouraged that everybody's really digging these virtual sessions because we're really having fun making them. And I did a little cursory tour of a cemetery that we'll be doing a few sessions in up in Hartford, Connecticut, that I think people are going to get really pumped about. Like, I was so excited walking through there, and you're going to see some names that you really, really know. And one of the things I'm most excited about, and hopefully our Seaside Shadows folks are too, because we get a lot of people that come and take both tours, or they take one tour each year. And while we're working on new tours, they're like, they've got all the mystic history, and this has allowed us to go throughout Connecticut and talk about things. And it's opened up just a world full of opportunity. And we're also going to be doing some more Celtic stories as well, hopefully from Ireland and Scotland. And we're still hoping to travel there with you, if not this year, next year, but we're still planning on this year, knock on wood. But I just am really excited, and you guys can tell me what you think, that we've just been able to expand. I love Mystic. They're always, as Andrew and I said, our VIPs. Nothing changes our VIP folks in Mystic on the ghost realm, but it's been exciting to explore what else is going on in the Nutmeg State.
Yeah, I think it's cool because there's so many different legends in Connecticut, being in New England and having such a rich history. I mean, there's so many stories that span across generations, and the native traditions and their stories as well. And I just feel like there's a wealth of information. And as much as we love Mystic, there are so many different stories to be told out there.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like New England and Massachusetts, people know that they really have history. If you go up, into the North Country, people are really involved in it. But I feel like Connecticut's always gotten such like a strange reputation that people have forgot it's a great home for New England legends too. And so this has been a really nice opportunity to explore that.
I think people associate us with New York, and it's not part of New England. So they're like, Connecticut, whatever.
Yes. And Fairfield County is kind of part of New York, to those people's credit, but they've got some cool stuff too. And New York does too. It's just not quite the same as New England legends, but a lot of our people, as we've discussed, have connections with New York it being the main city nearby, at least the shoreline area back in the day, and very easily accessible via boat. So that definitely plays a part. But I think you're right. I think Connecticut had a loss of identity being roped in with New York, and hopefully our legends and tales of people here bring it back to its own identity. That's my hope. And I honestly didn't even know when I was walking through Hartford and walking through the cemetery there, the famous people that were there. I had no idea that they like were all linked to Connecticut, and it was pretty.
Is this cemetery? I don't want to spoil it, but is this cemetery? Does it start with a letter C?
It does.
Hey, I love that cemetery.
Yeah.
I was actually, you know, what's weird? I was just reading about that cemetery today. Literally, like I was on Wikipedia a couple of hours ago, because there was a very famous, glamorous woman that is from Connecticut and died in Connecticut, and she's buried in that cemetery, and she's one of my favorite people ever. So
if it's the glamorous lady you're talking about, I went to go see her. And she's definitely going to be on a segment soon, very soon. Just so, I mean, a lot of Mark Twain's friends are even buried in this place. There's just like a lot of really, really neat people that I think people are going to be pumped to see. And I foresee, because it's such a big cemetery, you'll see each of the Seaside Shadows members there at some point in the coming months, because you wouldn't even know we're in the same place. It's to give you a hint, it was 270 acres big. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a really big cemetery. So
really early to find a grave.
I know. There's maps at the beginning though, which is incredibly helpful. When you pull in through the gates, you'll see a big visitor kiosk with maps. And I was like, I'm going to need one of those. But then you still need a minute to just sort of take it all in. And it will also be a really great opportunity to talk about new grave markings. We've talked a lot about colonial grave markings on our tours, and while those are great, especially considering the limited tools people had available to engrave them, there's some incredible stones that come about during the Victorian era that would take your breath away, which is what they were intended to do, right? But like they wanted to show off a lot, and they do a good job at it in this cemetery. So that's something to look forward to. If you guys don't have any questions, I'm just gonna let people for a moment, if they want to send a last minute question, they can. Otherwise, I'm just gonna give a quick reminder that we have 3 segments other than these Mystical Mondays where you can chat with us. And if you missed it and you want to send us a question after watching it, not live, you can. You just send us an email or comment, and we'll put it in next week's. We're going to be here every Monday for the foreseeable future. So make sure you send us your questions about anything in the paranormal, ghost tour, ghost hunting topic, or on the segments we've done. And if you want to watch our other segments and leave us questions there too, we have Witchy Wednesdays, where we do a variety of history going back kind of to ancient times, and ways that you can heal with herbs today. And we're also starting to sell some of the things that we're making under Seaside Shadows Magic, so you can keep an eye out for that. We're also doing Cemetery Saturdays, which is the one you've heard us talk a lot about today, that features the history of Connecticut residents over the years. And we'll probably expand and go beyond, but Connecticut's keeping us busy for the time being. And then we have Spooky Stories Sundays, where every evening, just around sunset, we tell you a legend that is a little bit bone chilling. So make sure you follow on Facebook if you want to watch live, but you can also follow on Instagram and YouTube to watch later, usually the same day, if not then the next day. And we are doing virtual tours every Friday in Mystic, alternating downtown and Graveyard. And a Salem virtual tour is coming. You can still get gift cards on seasideshadows.com to use for the future. And if you want to get 25% off, you use the promo code Haunt the Future so that we can see you then. And you can also subscribe to our Patreon and get a variety of things, including personalized spooky stories from one of us every month, as well as personalized readings in your inbox. So that's something, if you're into the psychic and the spooky, that you may be interested in. Did you guys have anything else that I'm forgetting that we have coming up for everybody?
I have a comment.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so Stacy agreed about she talking about Massachusetts. She said the closer you get to Massachusetts, the more excited I get because there's a bigger chance of me getting to check out that area. I would love for you to do something in Springfield.
We'll put it on our radar, at least get near the border. Yeah, we'll definitely make our way there. Maybe we'll make a little pit stop when we go to Salem, see if we can do something in the area. But our Massachusetts folks have a special place in our heart too. And Salem has a special place in our heart. That's one of our few Seaside Shadows locations in New England. Salem and Mystic. We like ports and sea merchants and sea captains. We've kind of got a vibe going with that here. And I know a lot of you have asked in the past about, TV stuff, things like that. We're definitely trying to use our time wisely to plan for the future, so you never know. And I'm also working on planning some new possible books for the future. So definitely continue to follow us. So we're always coming up with new things. And thank you for watching if you watched live. And if you have questions, make sure to send them. But happy Mystical Monday, and we will see you next week.
Happy on.
Bye.